We're very pleased to see you here. And we're here to try to face some very real issues. This is not a session about all the wonderful things that we have done. It's not about all our visions, but it's facing down on political resistance to address the needs of key populations, the way we've already heard about it the days we've been together, and will continue to hear about it. So I'm happy to be co-chairing the session with Michel Sidibe, as you know, the Executive Director of UNAIDS. I'm here also as the chair of the Robert Carr Civil Society Network Fund that are enabling action by key population, but belong also to the Norwegian Public Health Institute in Norway. And we will be facilitating here together. The way we've structured the session, you will notice that there are different perspectives from different countries that will come up. And we also would like to face the kind of issues where there are negative forces. It's not just the AIDS movement that are lobbying for political action. We know there are a lot of conflicting movements, there are a lot of ideas out there, the world around us is changing, and let's try to, through focusing on these specific introductions, we'll have tried to broaden our perspective so that we can try to get real about what this is all about. So Michel will give some opening words, and we will get on with our panel here. They will all speak for a period of 7 to 10 minutes about their perspective and have the time to set out their experience. And then we'll have a short conversation between the members here, but all the way through, think through what you want to bring into this conversation from your own experience. And again, not the wonderful visions, not the dull concept of political will that seems not to contain a leadership that brings us forward, but getting real about the resistance we face, the restrictions we face, not just from legislation, but also from the whole social fabric of our society. Those of us that are electing these politicians and parliamentarians, that's part of the puzzle that we're facing. The discrimination and the resistance is not just at the top of government, but it's also in our societies at large. With this, Michel, you have your opening words.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sigren. It's always very nice to be with you and with this strong panel today to talk about issues which is certainly the most important. If you look at our last report, the miles to go, this report was trying centrally to show that we are not addressing a key population like we should do. It's trying to show clearly that we are faced with a major barriers, that we have gaps in service delivery, but we are also faced with injustices which our programs are capable to reach people like it should be. So we are nowhere. I want to say that we are nowhere, and that is true when we are talking about key population, even in terms of 1990. I'm not just talking about ending AIDS. If you go to Central Africa and I think and West Africa, you go because people think that is only Eastern Europe and Central Asia issues. It is a global issue. We need to address it. And the key population or in the data is showing, and I don't want to spend all my time talking about the data you know already, but like I was saying yesterday night, 47% of the new infection worldwide is occurring now amongst a key population. And in some region, 97% of the new infection, for example, in Eastern and Central Asia, or occurring amongst a key population. I said 97%. So we cannot really continue to just talk about a key population like if we are mainstreaming them into our response globally. We need to be able really to take a time to reflect on our strategies, take time to look at what is negotiable, what is non-negotiable, which type of typology we need to do, because country after countries, you have a different situation, and we have different responses. If you take Ukraine and you compare to Russia, you can see that they're close, but different responses, different approaches. So what is happening? What are the main barriers which are not helping us to deal with those issues we have been identifying already with my sister, Ruth, when she was a president, even before being president. 35 years back already, we were talking about, ending stigma and discrimination. With Jonathan, get rid of laws that criminalize and marginalize. We're talking about promoting gender equality, making sure that our education system can take into account those issues. Apply, people-centered, right-based approaches. Get people access to services. We have been saying all of that for years. So what I want from this discussion today, Sigren, is that if we can be able little bit to learn more about how we can influence the programmatic approach, what type of mechanism we need to put in place. Or we talking about a vertical approach when we are talking about dealing with the issues, and make sure that we are courageous to have maybe a service delivery approach which will be closer to people by using communities approach, by using NGOs, reinforcing their capacity. What we do in funding, because we know that funding is not there. When it's there, is not necessarily supportive of those groups who are working closely with those population. So those are some kind of issues, and our advocacy, how we will really make this advocacy stronger to the point that we were not scared to talk about decriminalization. I want just to stop there to open the discussion and make sure that
Thank you, Michel, for setting the scene and also bringing in the fact that political leadership is not just putting money in a big bag for HIV, but it penetrates all that we do in the different sectors where we work, also in organizing healthcare, but also the whole social care services, and of course the legislative bodies. So that's the agenda we have before us. And now I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker to say, that is Madam Minister. I know I should have said Your Excellency. The trouble is with His Excellencies, they come and go, So having been through it myself, it's very uncomfortable to be an excellency and then suddenly you're not an excellency anymore. So let's leave those things. But Mila, you have been both an advocate and now a politician in Macedonia, and your background in social work has been very impressive. And you've been working in a country now where there has been major change. So we look very much forward to hear your experience when it comes to overcoming political resistance.
Can I have the Hi to everybody, and thank you for the introduction. There is no need of excellency introduction, because I think that we are all here to discuss the challenges that we have in front of us. Yeah, we have the vision, we already have few steps, but something that is in front of us, we must to discuss and to open a new horizon in the HIV prevention and supporting of the people in our country. I think that our story is very unique, and I hope that the other countries will follow, because something that we create is the political commitment was there more than 15 years, I can say. But the political commitment is really nothing if not comes with a real commitment. That means money, but also services, support, and changing the environment to support the people in the country. And that's why we have the 15 civil society organizations that are 15 years active in Macedonia, and they create all the strategies, and they gain the political commitments, and they offer the services for the people. But the previous government was not really committed, and they didn't transfer the money to civil society and never see them as a partner. And that's why with involving the vulnerable groups and key population through the civil society organization, we create the advocacy process by the book. Everything was very good, structured, with all the steps that needs to be overtaken in the process. And in the moment where the HIV preventive programs were in risk, because the Global Fund just they say, okay, there is a transition period for Macedonia, and you must to show the real commitment as a country. In that moment, all these 15 organizations create alliance, and together with the opposition also in that time, now the government, they create the sustainability program or sustainability plan for HIV prevention. And the period was very, very good, because in one moment, when everything was done with advocacy, everything was prepared by the civil society organization, the new government comes, the prime minister was very open for this, and we finally have the HIV preventive program supported fully by the government and implemented by the Ministry of Health. Of course, the Minister of Health is here. We must to say thank you to him. But also the civil society organizations are part of the system. And this is the first step that we will show how the social contracting can give the better results than just giving the services through the national system, health system, preventive system. And this is not just happening in the health sector, but it's happening in the social sector, because we as a country think that if we have the plural system of offering services to the key population of vulnerable people, we can gain more for these people. And this is the new concept of this government, and I'm sure that we will be successful. And maybe it's okay to say that we are a low prevalence country, but again, in between 2015, 2017, we have the increase of 60% of new cases. This means that we are a small country, but again, we must to prevent to not have a bigger problem than we have in this moment. And I will share just a few numbers, in that our program is 1.5 million and 800,000 just for a prevention. This means that half of the money are for the prevention. That is, for me, it's good. And these civil society organizations are offering on a yearly basis 2,100 services to the 15,000 people. And we are okay with that. Thank you.
Can I just get back to you when it comes to issues like discrimination, criminalization? How does that play out in your country? We know that discrimination in healthcare is a huge issue in all countries of the world. And part of the resistance is often associated with the way we discriminate certain groups of people and certainly key populations. So I'm just wondering, criminalization also we hear a lot about here. How does that affect access in your country? And does that require a political push?
Okay, I think that criminalization, it's a little bit a gray zone. this government will not read the law as says that it's a criminal thing if you just share the HIV with someone, because everybody is responsible for their health. But the previous government was just one moment where they tried to do this. But now I think everything is okay and calm. Maybe we need to have maybe strong law there and to say that it's not part of the criminal code, but this is something that still needs to be advocated probably. It's not open as an issue. For a discrimination, we are in a process of adopting the new anti-discrimination law. We finally recognize the gender and we recognize the sexual orientation inside. And the law is very positive, scored by the European Commission, UN, we have the letters from them, and also the Venice Commission. In that law, we guarantee the professional commission, because the health status is also part of non-discrimination in our country. And I'm sure that all the institutions in the next period that will try to discriminate, the Commission will recognize this and we will create the atmosphere. We as a government propose this law. We know that our institutions are not very prepared for this, but we will prepare in the process. But if the Commission recognizes this and alarm and send the letters to the institution, we will prepare and move the system a little bit.
Thank you, and we can come back to some of these things afterwards. But I think it's important to keep on asking ourselves all the time. We've come that far, but and also as a civil society space, you have that in Macedonia. Now, if that civil society is somehow also delivering service, does that compromise civil society voice in actually speaking up? So those are issues that I think, in different countries looks different, but just to have them on the table for our conversation. Our next speaker is Daouda Diouf from Senegal. Yeah. And he's now the executive director of Enda Tiers-Monde and has been working in these fields, both programmatically as an advocate, and he's also on the reference group of the HIV and Human Rights Commission, of the reference group, I should say, of UNAIDS, plus a lot of other areas. So you have a broad perspective, but the country. So I'll ask Michelle afterwards, after you speak, to keep on prodding you on some of the issues that you may not mention when you speak.
Thank you very much. I just want to apologize for my very francophone accent.
Mine is Norwegian,
Mine is Malian. And when we talk about resistance and key population, in the context of West and Central Africa, where I come from and where I work, just to say that my organization works in about 15 countries in the region, delivering services. Sometimes the only organization that are talking to and delivering services to key population. So sometimes we feel isolated in countries, being alone. And we are also trying to build the capacity of and the leadership of key populations themselves. And work also with other civil society organizations from the country to take on of the work we need to do for key population. But doing so, we face a lot of resistance, not only political resistance, but a whole series of a variety of resistance. And you'll ask me, how do you survive? But that is the sad, but that is the reality. Because when we talk about key population in countries, at the very beginning, they were called invisible population. And then we worked and provide evidence and data. And that proved that they are no longer invisible. And then we were told, oh, they were marginalized people. And then we said if they're marginalized, then they should not be no longer marginalized because they're citizens, they're human beings, and they have their rights. And then, yeah, we were told, okay, then they're unserved. So when we say if they're unserved, why don't we serve them? Well, with program and that respect that address their needs and that respect their right and their dignity. And now we are, in some countries we are told, oh, they were forgotten population or group. Just to tell you that even in the narrative, there is a paradigm shift that is needed. There's a lot of resistance at that level. And that narrative comes from the social and ideological representation and religious representation that we have, and the way we see people, their dignity, their right as human beings, as citizens. And this will determine the way we serve them. And what I want to say about that is that there is also resistance at the health system. Because there is the most unserved, and those who are getting the services that are the more poor in terms of quality. And what is happening in most of the time in countries, government used to say, okay, this key population intervention and program, let's leave it with civil society organization, because they feel uncomfortable, and they maybe sometimes they're not ready to take on the social transformation and the political price that it takes to set up program for key population. Because this issue is highly political also, and we need to recognize that and work on it. And the last resistance that what I see is that the poor level of investment for the program and policy for key population. If you take any kind, any being the Global Fund, PEPFAR, and bilateral donors, the investment that goes for key population program are minimal compared to what is going to elsewhere. And when we look at the figure, and Michelle talked about it, the new infection they're happening among key population. And if we take a country like West Africa, we said there are progress that have been made, but we're still lacking behind. But if you disaggregate the cascade, then you'll find out that the access to the first 90 testing is around 23% for key population. Less than 80% for key population access to treatment. And less than 8% of people who have viral suppress. And those people are carrying the high burden of the epidemic in many of our countries. What is it that we're not serving them? It's because of we're having political, technical, social, religious, moral resistance to the fact that we should recognize that they should be the priority of the program. And what is happening is that we are facing in all of the countries where we are working, that I know, key population are criminalized, they have lack access to services, there are a lot of legal barriers, and their rights and dignity are every single day violated without anybody raising a single finger to say this is wrong, unless civil society organization. But here lies the problem. If you go to our countries, the reality is that most of the civil society organizations, who are the drivers of social and political change, if you go to any single country of West Africa and Central Africa, those who are driving the political change are the, what you call in French, mouvement citoyen, citizens' movements. La lucha, Yanama in Senegal, Turcha in Congo, Lanama in Balais Citoyen, and many of them today in Mali, many of them today in Côte d'Ivoire, many of them today in Guinea, many of them in Ghana. But the level of investment that is going to civil society, those actors who are ready to serve key population, is very minimal. And the result of it, which is sad, is many of civil society organizations are closing their doors. Their programs are being closed because of lack of funding and significant funding, that is going to civil society organizations. This is also political resistance, and this is political technical resistance from the donor to the government. And these are issues that we should point out and put out clearly if we want to change the game. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to stop here, but this is the reality that we need to address truly and meaningfully in our countries.
Dauda, thank you very much for your input coming from the same region and listening to you. You know, I want just to ask you something. When we were younger than we are today, the only country in my region where we could have even a name for a gay population was Senegal. And they used to call them Gorjigen. Yeah. And Gorjigen, it was a way to say is not a man, is not a woman. But they were completely accepted in the society. I could not go to any wedding, any social gathering without having those gay community being present. And they were included in any event, any debate, any discussion. And why suddenly we have been experiencing, and that I'm talking from Mali to Senegal to, because of the names was coming from your place, but it was the same name we were using. Suddenly we are seeing this intolerance. People become violent, people are not accepting, people are incapable at a political level. Bad bills are being introduced. You and myself, we have been fighting to make sure that 2 gay men we have been arrested and put in jail for 9 years. So I want to understand not just the technical word, but what is about this intolerance which we are seeing today? How we deal with it, how we change that.
It is a good question and very difficult question. I have an answer. I don't have all of the answers. We see our countries as a static country, but we don't realize how most of our country are under influence of ideology, of conservatism. All of our countries, including the North, the extreme right are taking the power in all of your countries. So it's not about Africa. It's our whole society being transformed now. And the same kind of conservatism and ideology are taking over the right discourse of tolerance, of human rights, and the right discourse of the right of human being to access and enjoy their own rights. Now, I think this is one thing. The second is also, I think our government are failing to protect their citizens, which is one of their duty in our countries. The other thing is also, you know, we can see the link between the increase of inequality, lack of solidarity, with all of this attitude and behavior towards the most marginalized, not only key population, but most marginalized in our countries. And then maybe this is one of the reasons that we should also take into account. As your second question is, what can we do? I think we have to invest and support the right stakeholders. When you come to our countries, sometimes the discourse that we hear is that, the first thing that you hear when there is an arrest against one of the key population is statement from outsiders. I think the time has come where we need to know that the best investment is investing in local stakeholders. We know the language, the acknowledge the culture, and we are ready to be the change agents into the transformator of our own society. So that's why this moment is critical, not to let the civil society organization dying because of lack of funding of support, but if you are supporting civil society, we are supporting people who can really generate social transformation, which include inclusion of key population and other marginalized groups, including young girls and adolescents.
Thank you. We'll again keep these issues on the table. We're already starting to see the role of community systems and community organizations as pretty crucial here, but we need to understand who they are and what they do in each context, because it's also the risk of not being able to speak, but it's also then the question of being shown that we don't want to care for these people, so you do it for us. And also we know that in the community there are different interests, and some of what you're saying, some of the movements are not necessarily for the change that we're looking for, because they may also not want to see the visibility of the key populations in their community. So already there we see quite a bit of issues. And please, again, keep this in mind as we bring you into the conversation after we've heard the other presentation. Now we'll move to Jonathan, and I suddenly have switched my papers. Michelle says he doesn't need a presentation. Open Society, Public Health Director, a huge experience in understanding what's happening in a number of the countries, not the least in Eastern Europe, but everywhere else also, I think, with the Open Society work. So, Jonathan, we'll just listen to you on some of these contradicting forces too. Yeah, sure.
Good morning. Thank you, Sigrun. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for organizing such an important conversation. The premise underlying this session is such an important one, which is that the scale up of programs for key and vulnerable populations is ultimately more of a political challenge than a financial one or a programmatic one. And if that's true, then obviously, as in any political challenge, it's important that we correctly identify and understand and strategically engage the resistance and the opposition. Now, in many ways, this opposition is highly familiar to us. So harm reduction programs, for instance, are opposed by a vast lobby in favor of the war on drugs, made up of tough-on-crime politicians, prosecutors, police, prison officials, and elements of civil society that promote a drug-free world. Rights-based programs for sex workers similarly are opposed by a powerful lobby for the abolition of sex work, including many liberal feminists, anti-trafficking campaigners, law enforcement, advocates for so-called community standards, and some former sex workers as well. Rights-based programs for LGBT communities are opposed by a powerful lobby for so-called traditional family values, including many churches and religious groups, educators, parents, child rights advocates, advocates for reparative therapies, and some advocates for the rights of cisgendered women. And programs that aim to integrate HIV with sexual and reproductive health and rights for adolescent girls are opposed by a powerful lobby against abortion, contraception, comprehensive sexuality education, and ultimately against women's control over their bodies. So we know this. So what is new about this topic? I think any of us could devote all of our time to unpacking the dynamics of any of the many lobbies that I've just described. But instead, I want to observe just a few general patterns from our experience. The first is one we know well, which is that in attempting to control, limit, in many ways criminalize the behaviors of vulnerable groups, these lobbies only end up making those behaviors more dangerous and more unsafe. So there is plenty of evidence to demonstrate that lobbying against the provision of condoms and comprehensive sexuality education, or against the provision of sterile syringes to people who use drugs, does not make key populations abstain from these practices. No, on the contrary, it rather increases their risk of HIV, other sexually transmitted infections, unwanted pregnancy, and so on. But what is less obvious, and I think an emerging dynamic we have to understand, is that sometimes lobbies against vulnerable groups actually come in the form of medical treatment. So take, for example, an effort in the United States by the drug company Alkermes to lobby judges and criminal justice authorities to mandate treatment with an injectable opioid blocker called Vivitrol for people who are charged with low-level drug offenses. Vivitrol is about 100 times as expensive as methadone. It is less well-researched, but it is nevertheless promoted to judges and policymakers as more convenient because it's injectable and more desirable because it's not an opioid. Ironically, this lobby rides a wave of concern about opioid overdose in the United States, yet the drug places those who stop using it, which is about 50% of people who receive their first injection, at a higher risk of overdose. What this simple example demonstrates, if you look closely, is that lobbies against vulnerable groups are too often driven as much by financial interests as by an ideology of trying to control people's bodies. Another example, the drug testing industry profits massively from policies that impose mandatory urine testing of people suspected of drug use, whether these are individuals who are diverted to drug courts, recipients of welfare and employment benefits, people caught up in raids of nightclubs, or what have you. In some cases, the same politicians who impose mandatory urine testing in the name of being tough on crime have a stake in these very industries, such as Florida Governor Rick Scott, who transferred his $62 million stake in a drug testing company to his wife before mandating urine testing for all welfare recipients in his state. Now, despite arguably being an inefficient waste of state resources to enrich politicians, these mandatory urine testing laws thrive on stereotypes about welfare recipients being more likely to use drugs. So this lobby is really a perfect circle. Stigmatize a vulnerable group in order to divert attention from the real reason behind a policy and reap a huge profit. But even where such blatant profiteering is not involved, one can argue that lobbies against vulnerable groups often try to influence the massive flows of development assistance for health in ways that financially benefit groups with specific ideologies. This can, of course, be dramatically seen in the ideological restrictions on U.S. development assistance for health, such as the global gag rule, the anti-prostitution loyalty oath, the Bush-era earmark for abstinence until marriage programs, all of which have huge lobbies behind them and which have the effect of diverting money away from sexual and reproductive health and rights groups towards more so-called pro-family and pro-life groups. Now, in all of these examples, it is important to realize that lobbies against vulnerable groups make the same claims about public health, human rights, civil society, and civil liberties that we and allies of key populations make. The lobby for injectable drug treatment makes claims about patient convenience. The lobby for drug courts makes claims about the compassionate diversion of drug users from the criminal justice system. The lobby for the global gag rule makes appeals to family values, to resisting cultural imperialism, to preventing the so-called radicalization of rights. All of these lobbies rely on a similar network of civil society groups, private philanthropy, and appeals to freedom of speech and expression that we in the HIV and human rights sector champion. So what this means is that this is not about whether we embrace civil society and human rights or not. It is actually about competing visions of civil society and rights, one of which happens to be backed by much greater financial and political power than the other. So to conclude, as long as our political leaders see an opportunity, or at least a lack of a cost, in capitalizing on social bias against vulnerable groups, these lobbies will continue to profit and to gain strength. And indeed, since time immemorial, people have profited from prejudice. Whether it's the slave trade, the history of colonialism, the caste system, history teaches us that othering is an effective tactic for consolidating economic power. In today's context of HIV and vulnerable groups, this takes on more subtle, but nevertheless deadly forms. It takes the form of direct profiteering on the back of ignorance or mistrust of vulnerable groups and rejection of scientific evidence. It takes the form of influencing the flow of development resources towards groups and ideologies that discriminate against others. But however it works, what is clear is that ideological and religious beliefs are not the only thing that underlies lobbies against vulnerable groups. It is also that people profit from their vulnerability, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly. I would argue that rather than pointing fingers, engaging in shame tactics, or accusing people of profiting from the vulnerability of others, we must see these lobbies as the product of a system of oppression in which fear and otherness undergird economic gain, in which politicians ultimately have more to gain from courting lobbyists and pandering to prejudice than from listening to vulnerable groups, a system in which the voices of the most marginalized are not heard, and a system in which unconscious bias about vulnerable groups guides political decision-making. As Sigrun pointed out, we have talked endlessly already at this conference about the need for political will to sustain an AIDS response. But political will is not enough. In an oppressive system, we should not be surprised when political will is subject to outside influence and unconscious bias. What we need to counter this is mobilization from the bottom up. Look at the experience of people in drug detention in the country of Vietnam. For years, the Vietnamese government operated a system of forced labor on the backs of people who used drugs, where drug users were forced to work for free in the service of private companies with powerful lobbies. But a combination of testimonies from people who had lived through that experience, of labor rights groups contacting European and American companies manufacturing goods in Vietnam, and of human rights defenders embarrassing the government changed its political calculus. Today, the number of people in detention is radically reduced, and labor practices have changed. This mobilization changed the political stakes. I said earlier that so long as political leaders see an opportunity, or at least a lack of a cost, in capitalizing on bias against the vulnerable, these lobbies will continue to profit. In Vietnam, advocacy and community mobilization decreased that opportunity and increased that cost. The lesson is a familiar one. We need to put people above profit. As a recently nominated politician from New York State, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently said, "This is about money versus people. They have money, we have people." We have long applied this principle in the fight for HIV treatment, and perhaps it's time to apply it in the fight for prevention and the rights of vulnerable groups as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So what we hear is we can't be naive about political leadership and political power, and that we need to unpack those interests that are behind. And as we go further in the discussion, I think it would be very important to hear, does it look different in different countries? And I think now we don't have time since Jonathan spent most of his time already, but afterwards I think it would be good if Jonathan can say a little bit about the difference in different countries, because unpacking these issues needs to be done locally and with the eyes of the vulnerable groups themselves. And how do we enable that analysis and understand what those forces are? Michel, you will introduce the last.
Yes, but I want to just react on what Jonathan said. Jonathan, I think, is a very good overview and a very strong analysis. But you know, when I am traveling and I'm meeting political leaders, you know what exactly they are saying to me? They are saying, you know, I am generally in power for 3 years. Their vision is not for 10 years or 12 years. I'm in power for 3-5 years. And when I am making any kind of survey, a quick survey in my population, they're telling me from Central America, where I have been, to Asia, to Central Asia, to Eastern Europe, to Africa, they're telling me, you know, we don't want those key population. We don't want sex workers. We don't want a gay community. We don't want people who inject the drugs. Is coming very high in their survey from people. So how you will change this politician who are basing all their action on their vote if we don't address the central issue down there? That's my point.
Let's come back to that in the conversation, right?
Yeah, thank you.
So
that is very important because honestly, is one of the biggest challenges we are facing. When you have a bill in Uganda, you know, it was very simple. Let me do a quick survey, and 97 to 96% are saying this bill is excellent. We don't want a gay community. So I think if we don't change this perspective in some way, it's not helpful for us. But let me introduce, you know, my sister Ruth Dreyfus. I think you don't need introduction. Ruth was sharing, as you know, and chairing the Global Commission on Drug Policy, became the first woman president of Swiss Confederation in 1999, was the one who really introduced all the reform on drug legislation in Switzerland, was also sharing the Commission on Intellectual Property Rights, Innovation and Public Health, was co-chair of the Secretary General high-level panel on access to medicine, and she is a member of the International Commission Against the Death Penalty. So, Ruth, let me just give you the chance to share.
Thank you, Michel, for this kind word. Good morning, everyone. You will hear the third French pronunciation today. I must say, I feel very humble and privileged. Looking back on the 10 years I was in charge of social and health policy in my country, and I feel very humble if I listen to you and your experience. Not only because Switzerland is a wealthy country with a scientific community counting some world-known experts in HIV/AIDS, like Dr. Hirschel, for instance, a well-educated population, and the general health coverage was just introduced when the therapy was also available. So this favorable condition makes me measure all the means we had in hand to fight against the epidemic, which took Switzerland harsher than any other European country in the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s. It was only a matter of will and of pragmatic approach to fight with good expectation of success. But I was also helped by our political system. Shared responsibility between all important political parties and between the central authorities and those of canton and municipalities. The fact also that the citizens have the power to challenge most of the parliamentarian decision and to propose themselves political answers to the problem they feel, even if they are in minority, even they cannot convince perhaps the majority, they can launch a public discussion about their issues. Yes, this necessity to convince the other parties, and more important, the obligation to convince a majority of citizens in general ballots, was help and burden together. The debate had to take place. Let's say the elephant was not only in the room, you had just to explain how you could tame it. My duty was, first of all, to adopt a language, I would say a non-political correct language and a communication style that was first considered as shocking. We had to call a cat, as we used to say in French. I had to speak first about condom, about men having sex with men, about leather men, for instance, and some sexual conducts that were not accepted by other people. So I had to put a shining light on the lives, the dignity, and the needs of our fellow men and women touched by the epidemics. But I was helped in this by the very vivid and demanding, exacting, claiming, and knowledgeable gay movement, followed by organized sex workers. They were still stigmatized and facing some practical, generally not legal discrimination, but they were not criminalized and had, in this sense, no punishment to fear. Democracy is, in my country, an obligation to dialogue, to good information, to freedom of association. But it is not everywhere the case. I am deeply worried, deeply concerned about the climate created in so-called illiberate democracies. Can you imagine a greater contradiction in words than this? The heinous tweet policy, populism, xenophobia, they are backlashes in democracy, and the backlash in democracy is always also a backlash in the fight against the HIV. Let me come to the real difficulty to overcome reluctance, politician, reluctant law and order professional, and reluctant public opinion. They laid this difficulty into the fact that conducts are criminalized still in my country. Let me speak about two groups. Two groups, I would say, of people who were invisible persons, as you said before. The first of them became visible through their consumption, through their presence in the streets, and I think speaking about the drug users. And as you remember, perhaps in my country, it was a very visible phenomenon in the 80s and beginning 90s when we had open scenes, needle parks, and so on. But this visibility obliged us really to act. And in this sense, we had to explain to the population that even if we were not able to discuss about decriminalization, even if we were not able to discuss about the constraint international convention had put on the policy in Switzerland in drug policy, we had to explain that there was an emergency to act. An emergency to act that was obliging us to create safe spaces, safe possibilities to encounter the people, to bring them to access to the means they needed to protect themselves, to protect their beloved ones, to protect their environment. And this was the story of harm reduction. We had to explain that even something that is prohibited by law is something that is not a negation of the civic rights and the fundamental rights of the people. And this is a contradiction that is not very easy to bear for a politician. The law exists, but we create places where this law is not applied because we have to save lives. So this is the way we could develop heroin prescription, safe consumption room. It began with the needle exchange, it continues with drug checking, and we have a lot to do also, even if we are not at the point that we are decriminalizing in the law, but often in practice, the conduct of drug users. The second group, and I think this we are still in a position where the fight is difficult, second group of invisible people are the illegal migrants. And this is perhaps the most difficult group to touch because these people are hidden. These people have no trust in the authorities. These people are afraid that if they are tested AIDS, they might be expelled from the country. The people who receive a medical help are those who fear that if they are expelled, they will lose this medical support. Mm-hmm. These people are also in communities that often are more taboo, have a stronger taboo about AIDS from their origin than it is the case in Switzerland. And often migrant workers in general, but illegal migrants more particularly, are in the situation of keeping the community strong because it's the only place where they can really live. So I would say democracy and decriminalization are the big tasks we have as politicians.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have to apologize on behalf of Michel as he has to leave. But I thought that at this time we should have these that have spoken from very different perspectives speak together. On the other side, it seems to me that it's enough of a convergence here to start having our conversation with the audience. And I really hope that some of you would want to go to the mic to both raise issues with what you've heard, but also maybe what you haven't heard, what you've missed. For me, one of the important things I'm noticed from the conversation is very much aligned with what the Robert Carr Civil Society Network is all about. And you'll find a report From Invisibility to Indivisibility. That is the annual report of that fund. But as we have agreed, unless the key population themselves are able to name the issues, and one of the important things that this group is doing is to try to analyze and assess and understand those barriers and constraints the way they are in each country. Because I think that's also very clear from what we've heard, that unless we understand the local situation, the national situation, we're not able to understand. US is very different from Senegal or Macedonia or whatever, but some of the same undermining forces are there. Some of the enabling forces are there, but we need to discover them. And we also need within our groups to see where is our alliances, who can we work with? Because individual key population groups may be too weak to deal with this on their own, and certainly enabling of more regional or global support, but also finding alliances with others that deal with some of the same oppressing forces, have to oppose some of the questions that we now have heard. So this is where I think some of the answers is, how do we enable that understanding from below, whether we are in a democratic society under pressure, where we are in a place where civil society space is being squeezed, where we're in a place where we're somehow co-opted to do things that then limit our voice. Okay, good. Now I have some people here, and I'll ask my panel members to listen carefully so that you can respond to that and at the same time interact with each other. So let's start with number one, and then we'll go turn. And try to be brief, but definitely try to come up with what we haven't spoke about or taking our discussion forward. How do we deal with this? Yes.
Certainly, thank you. My name is DJ Tabarak. I'm representative here of National Association of People Living with HIV Australia. I'm very glad, in fact, your introduction is a bit of a segue to what I wanted to talk about, which was, you were saying that some of the key populations by themselves, they can't actually they're weaker. And indeed, what's about to happen here, after being in Amsterdam and all the talk about Amsterdam coming back here after the US had to, the hosting of the US conference in '92, we're back at the same stage where in 2020, we're going to have a situation where key populations cannot attend the conference. We're talking sex workers, we're talking injecting drug users, we're talking people from Muslim countries which are being banned. The IAS is creating the barrier for participation by having the host country as the US. What we need is for people, and that's not just the people on the panel, but every single person here in this room, because it's up to you, every single one of you, to stand up and say, we need to move the conference to a place where everyone can be, because we cannot do this. There is nothing about us without all of us. And what I want to hear from you, on every single one of you, because you'll have an audience in front of you which will see your response. Are you going to help advocate for a change of venue, a change of host for 2020?
Okay, we'll leave this with all so one can think through what that means. Let's go to mic number 2.
Ulana Supran, I'm the Acting Minister of Health of Ukraine. First of all, I want to say that I don't think those barriers will be there in the United States. But secondly, what I'd like to talk about is a different problem.
Let her speak. Yeah.
A different problem that's happening. There is a war in Ukraine. We have done what we can on the level of the Ukrainian government, where we have brought in key populations. We're providing treatment for them. We're providing preventative programs. We are the only country in Eastern Europe and in Central Asia who has government-sponsored replacement therapy. And We have a very big problem because part of our country has been invaded and occupied by the Russian Federation, and the rules in the Russian Federation are very different than those in Ukraine. They do not provide care for key populations. On the other hand, they actually imprison key populations. They have to go underground. They don't provide replacement therapy. And we have entire sections of our country which are under Russian control, and we don't have access to our patients. So
Thank
what
you.
I'd like
I think
to hear...
you made the point, and then go on with your question.
What I'd like to find out from you is we're talking about these political ways that we can help each other in treatment for patients, providing treatment for patients, and bringing in groups that are particularly vulnerable. What I'd like to hear from you, as my colleague said, he'd like to hear a political statement. I may disagree with you, but it doesn't mean that you can't make a political statement. And I have the same request. I'd like to hear that you will continue to support sanctions against the Russian Federation so that the Ukrainian war will end, so that the Ukrainian territory will be returned to Ukrainian control, so that Ukraine can provide those services to its affected patients as well as vulnerable populations, and have us do what we want to do, which is reach our 90-90-90 goal and provide those responsibilities to our own people.
Thank you very much. I think that what we'll see now is we have a number of issues that are very much a global advocacy type of issue. I think we have to make sure that we drill this down also to what are the barriers for key populations living on the ground as they're meeting regulations, restrictions, so that we keep that both the global and the local in mind as we continue our discussion. Up there, mic 4.
Thank you. I'm Natalia Solovyova from Siberia, Russian Federation. Today much has been said about working in a dangerous field with dangerous environment, for example, propaganda law, criminalization, and some other. Often in some countries, and in some countries mostly, this work, I mean working with the key populations, done by small groups, grassroots organization, and my question is, what exactly your organization do for small grassroots groups, if it's relevant for you, and what special actions for the small grassroots organization working in difficult, dangerous countries you do, maybe some special actions.
Is that something
Thank you.
for you? I'd like to take another from mic number 2, since you're more people there than... Okay, yes?
Hello, my name is Pio Kenosi. I am from Botswana. I'm here with Success Capital. We work with key populations, mainly LGBTI. I had a question for Doda. Am I saying it right? Multiple panelists, actually. My first question for you is, you talked about certain numbers, and I'm wondering how you are able to get these numbers, how you're able to carry out your research, seeing as when most countries do census, that key populations are not necessarily included in the national census. Also, one for Jonathan, but maybe it can be also for Her Excellency and Ms. Dreidov, right? You talked a lot about ideologies and how they are mainly a barrier because ideologies are used by politicians in order to lobby for their own, to progress their own agenda. So I wanted to know if how can we? Do you have a strategy in place or something that you can suggest for us who work on the ground to persuade people who are mainly stopping us from getting what we need because of their ideology, and also in terms of Switzerland on decriminalization for drug users, don't you think that perhaps if we decriminalize drug usage, that then we can be able to properly help the people and also give them services in that regard? Thank you.
Let me suggest now, we have 3 more people that want to speak. I'm sure that my panel is smart enough to can hold on to these questions, because I would hate to stop any of those before the thing is over. So let's go back to mic number 1, then I'll have mic number 4 and 2. And that's what we can cope with, I think, at this stage, and then we'll get back to the panel. Yes, mic number 1.
My name is Hakan Seçkin-Elgin, and I'm a researcher at the London School of Economics. I'm sort of going to maybe comment on when you mentioned at the start leadership is a sort of empty, but it's not so empty, because in some ways we are asking political leaders, either as politicians or civil societies, to change, influence, or bring about a change in terms of their society's values, to consider human beings as human beings rather than anything else when they're engaging with them. But how far this orientation fits with the ways in which international aid industry has constructed what is expected from political leaders up to this point. Because political leaders are supported so long as, or promoted, for their support for our projects, programs, without any expectation to change their societies. And in a number of cases, of course, this meant that many international organizations supported totally anti-democratic leaders year in, year out, decade in, decade out. It's a very difficult enculturation to change at this moment. I mean, I think we are facing our own sort of created enemy, essentially. Thank you.
If I can add to your question a little bit, because I think that we use political will by financing something also to cover up what we don't do. You know, there's a discrepancy. We find something, we gain applause because we put some money there, but we don't do other things that probably are as important to get. So I see your question in that direction. So then let's go to 4.
Yes, thank you. I'm Ruth Messenger from the United States, here as a consultant to AIDS-Free World. First of all, I want to thank the panel, but I'm raising really a new issue, because it's an issue in which political involvement from some of the countries you represent could be critical. And that is that the International Labor Organization, which many of you have national connections to, does not recognize child marriage as a part of child labor. So there are 15 million, 12 million, however number you want, of new child brides each year who are not counted as child laborers. Obviously, these are young women who are losing all of their agency, as well as engaging in work that is of huge threat to themselves and their bodies and their human rights. And this is a place where the right political decision on the part of a number of nation states with the ILO could make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you. And the final comment here from mic 2.
Thank you. My name is Pove Folilosson, and I work with civil society in Sweden. In fact, what I want to take up today, you mentioned it before, that we give some money to show that we are dealing with what we are not dealing with, just to show that we are doing it. And what I miss in the debate is the issue of migrants in Western Europe. We are very good in Western Europe to take up others' problems, but not our own. And I don't see how in Western Europe you are dealing with the issue of key population of migrants. And you know all that because of the situation of HIV in Sub-Saharan Africa, migrants from Africa, they are all overrepresented in the statistics in the whole of Western Europe. And I don't see how you are dealing with it. It's so sensitive to talk about it. Key population, of course, I don't have anything against the lobbies of MSM, but even when dealing with migrants who are MSM, it's so sensitive. The migrant, as soon as you start talking about migration and HIV, that it's taking too much time, too much space. is so sensitive to talk about, and I don't see it in the debate. Stop talking about others' problems. Talk about what we are dealing with in a daily basis here. Don't give 10% of resources to work with 80% of the problems in Western Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think we've just picked the tip of the iceberg here, and a lot of what we're saying is we really need to map and understand these issues on our home ground, but also with the perspective of what that means in the broader sense. And now you have the challenge. I don't know who would start. We have questions from the big global issues of aggression and where you host AIDS conference to deep down to how you actually change attitudes and what are the kind of alliances we make and how do we actually create those safe spaces now in a new environment where the civil society itself is being threatened in a way and co-opted and divided on a lot of these issues. So please integrate your final comment with the answers. I think a number of these issues were expanding our reflections rather than requiring one specific. But I've asked Chris to speak to the issue of how we collaborate with Russia, since UNAIDS probably is closer than anyone to speak of that. Otherwise, please. Should we start with Jonathan, as long as you don't take too much time? And then we'll go this way. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll just make two comments. The first is, I think it was a mistake to select San Francisco for the next AIDS conference. I'm really surprised. I'm surprised the International AIDS Society didn't learn from the experience of Washington, D.C. in 2012. There are restrictions against people who've committed serious drug offenses or what the government of the U.S. calls crimes of moral turpitude. We will never know the number of sex workers, people who use drugs, who simply choose not to apply for a visa to come from to the conference because they don't want to disclose that on a visa application. It has a massive chilling effect. A number of us were very active in that advocacy in 2012. But let me just say one thing that I learned from that advocacy, which is that the International AIDS Society is not our enemy. The U.S. State Department is our enemy. Let's be very clear about that. It was so painful in Washington, D.C. to see so many activists target the IAS and to watch the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, give this glorious speech in which she seemed to get off scot-free for the very policies that were animating this in the first place. And you talked about dividing the movement. Let's not let governments divide us and succeed in divide and conquer strategies in that way is what I would say. I'll just make one point apropos of the panel. I think we need to learn so much more from the countries that have overcome this resistance, from Switzerland. We don't talk enough about the experience of Thailand in the 1990s, Brazil in the 1990s, the kind of enlightened pragmatism, calling a cat that Madame Dreyfus mentioned. And one question that I wanted to put to you, if you have time, is how much of that is about pressure from below? Because Michel, before he left, talked about political terms being temporary, which is true, but civil society is not temporary. It's permanent, it's sustainable. The communities will always be dealing with that. So how much are those politicians responding to that pressure?
Thank you.
Thank you for this question. It's clear that the pressure came from below, and the pressure came also from the families of the vulnerable people. For instance, the despair of family of drug users, seeing the people without access to what they needed, seeing them being exploited by the black market in the open scene, you know exactly how it was. But it was really the possibility for these groups to be heard, to be to be visible, to be, so it was also the structure of the political system that allows them to oblige the politician to react. So I think from the beginning there was a real collaboration between the organization and the political level. Well, I think to answer the question, having a conference without having the possibility of all to participate is a bad idea, but I share the idea of Jonathan. The enemy is not the IIS, the enemy is the political system and the political ambience that is now in the States. So let me just answer to two questions. One is decriminalization. I mean, we are now in Switzerland concerning drug addicts, drug users, in a situation where they can have all the services they need. I would say we are now in trustful contact with perhaps 90% of the drug consumers in Switzerland, giving them the possibility to receive what they want to receive, which is not always what others would like them to give. So this is not, the decriminalization is not the matter to have a greater access. It is a matter to have a more coherent policy, in the sense that you cannot for decades say that something is prohibited and in the meantime try really to avoid the harms of this policy. Now, on migrants, I think this is very important, and I thank you for this remark. I mean, this is our problem. I tried to bring it shortly also on the table. When I said that it is difficult, I am not despaired. We have the possibility to care the people. We have the possibility to give them access to the treatments if they accept to go out of their hidden situation. And this we can do working with the communities that are in our country. And I must say we have groups of African women playing an immense role in advocating for their sisters who are ill or touched by the virus. And they are also the people who are making all the information inside the community, and we have to work with them.
Thank you. I think we'll go here now, and we have only 4+ minutes left, but we should give justice to the kind of questions that we have heard. Yeah.
Okay, just 2 minutes. I will respond to all the questions and discussion here in one. I think that we are living in a dynamic world and dynamic society, and the human rights and respecting the human rights, it's not so sexy word anymore. And we have a lot of countries that promote discrimination, social exclusion, and they're really loud in this. And we will not stop, because it's a dynamic and it's a cycle. But something that we must to be more focused and to create the processes that will support the people. I think that Open Society Foundation, they already had the Access to Justice program and legal empowerment. And if we empower the people to know their rights, it's easier just to create the atmosphere that they need to respect their rights. Because not just the pressure, not just the movements are needed, but the people needs to feel that they have a rights and someone needs to respect. But not just as a beneficiary of the service, but they need to be proactive and active in the process of the creation of every system. And we miss this in the process of advocating. And I think we must come back and to push the things in the right direction.
Yeah. Thank you. I love your focus on social exclusion, because understanding the dynamics there in each society is an extremely important part of discrimination, but also of opening up solutions for key populations to be visible and move. Yeah.
What about 2020 from everyone?
Yeah, support. Just to remove all barriers, if it's possible, or move the conference, but everybody needs to participate and not to be...
I think I have the same position, that also take it as an opportunity to keep pushing and putting pressure on the U.S. If they want to hold it, then they should remove all of the barrier. Two questions. One on data. I think, I don't know whether you've been this morning in the plenary session, Dr. Stephen Barrell, who first spoke, made a nice presentation in one of the figures there. I mean, we can share those information. But plus, what we are doing in West Africa, we have several civil society organizations doing monitoring of the access to the cascade. So we have our own monitoring system. And what we just discussed this morning, we had a civil society organization meeting. We are going to publish shadow report and alternative report from the ground, from civil society, that are not talking only about rhetorics and data that are nicely set, but about what is happening in the ground. The reality of HIV, how are we achieving things and how are we failing in providing services and providing funding, and what are the key legal, social, societal barriers that hinder key population to access to these services. And then we also will challenge political leaders and political decisions through that alternative, independent shadow alternative report from civil society. That's what we will be doing. And then the second one on migration, it was challenging. One thing, 2 years ago, there was a very good report from France about migrants and HIV. What the report said, in short, is that migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, they got infected when in Europe. The thinking was, oh, they're bringing HIV to Europe. In fact, because of a lack of access to services, precarity, promiscuity, and then stigma and discrimination that put them in a situation of risk and vulnerability. So to a level that most of them who are infected after they arrive in Europe. Just to say that the system is not just, the system is not fair, the system is feeling stigma and then inequity. And then I think, you are right, we think of how we are going to address the issue of migrants and the issue of migration is more complex. Migrant and HIV here is another issue. But I would advise that you see that report that was led by Annabelle and others. It's an excellent research that was done in France.
Thank you. Yeah. I think what we're talking about here is exactly what you're saying, shadow reporting, or getting the truth out, getting the figures out, sharing it, understanding what's happening. That's the only thing that can expose some of those misconceptions. My colleague here, Chris, will speak to the issue around the Russia question. Huh?
I'm not sure I have an answer.
You
but
don't
I think,
have to have an answer.
But what I hear is, and I hear it in other sessions as well, is that, and it's something that we've tried with this conference to bring in the issues beyond the HIV epidemic and the HIV response and how everything is interconnected. And it's a bit overwhelming to see how much, what are the crises that we are facing externally and how much we're demanding from the HIV response to respond to them and be the HIV response that deals with them. And it's clear to me that we can't do it alone. We can use HIV as an entry point, but we need to start working as a HIV response differently and connect with other movements differently. And we're paralyzed because we're trying to do this alone. We're trying to deal with Russian regulations on propaganda and foreign agencies if civil society is receiving funding internationally, to how we deal with Ukraine and the war, to laws that are beyond us. or funding harm reduction entirely through the HIV response. That is not possible. So for me, it really is about working differently. In Russia, we as UNAIDS do not have a country office. We have a regional office because we're not allowed to work in Russia at the country level. So what we can do is if we are going to support civil societies, how do we then support civil society in Russia and other countries so that it's a regional program? So we find ways around it. But again, it's how do we work a little bit differently now? That we use HIV as an entry point, but we need to make connections differently with others.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all. Chris has been actually on the committee that has set up this conversation, so thank you to him. Also, thank you to each one of you and to the panel. I'm not planning to have a long wrap-up comment here, but I think that maybe what should sit in our mind as we go out of there is that when we talk about resistance, when we talk about restriction, these are actually willed actions. It's not something we do out of ignorance. If you do resist, if you do have restrictions, somebody wants it to be there. So we're not facing ignorance in a sense. We have to expose that these are willed action. We also have to expose the conflicting interests at all levels of society, both in politics and, as John pointed out, also in civil society movement. And we need to figure out how we learn and understand from where the problem is and where those partners that both feel the need for change and can name what the issues are, they can help us understand what alliances we can build, what are voices that needs to be amplified. And a lot of us need to be a lot more humble because we speak a lot all the time. There need to be space to listen and learn from each other. So that's my final conclusion for this session. Thank you so much for being willing to be part of this and for the experience we've had around us to help us think a little bit beyond what we normally think on these issues. Thank you.